Welcome to the Hockey Writers Maple Leafs Lounge, a weekly show from our Toronto Maple Leafs writing crew, bringing you the latest news, rumors, trades, player grades, prospects, and much more. From training camp to the playoffs, from draft day to the trade deadline, our team covers everything that happens with the blue and white. Come on in and pull up a chair. Welcome to the Maple Leafs Lounge.
And welcome back to another episode of the Maple Leafs Lounge. I am your host, Peter Baracchini, and once again, I'm joined by my fellow colleagues over at the Hockey Writers, Julian Mongillo and Alex Hobson. Before we get started with the show, this week's episode is brought to you by the Hockey Writers Sports Betting Guide, a brand new source for your daily sports betting odds, lines, props, and futures. Whatever you want to bet on, we will have you covered for daily fantasy strategies and analysis. Be sure to follow THW Bets on Twitter to get the latest on everything sports betting related. Before we get into the show, guys, how are you both doing?
I'm doing good. I'm still defrosting from that Winter Classic. It was a little bit chilly. I was at the very top of the one bleachers there. So I wish there was a better result, but it was a pretty good atmosphere out there.
Alex, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's been a solid week. It's been enjoyable watching the Leafs getting back into the win column after however many games of letting 4 or 5 goals in a row. And obviously, last night's game was a little bit of an outlier compared to the last two. But either way, yeah, things have been doing better so far. So,
and it seemed like everything seemed to there seemed to have been a spark since that Winter Classic game. And Alex, back-to-back games, solid outings, and as clear-cut as you want to near 60-minute efforts against the Dallas Stars and the Carolina Hurricanes. What were your initial thoughts and what stood out the most in those two games?
I think the obvious answer is Erik Källgren. I mean, I don't know how many people were expecting to get a look at Källgren this year. I think maybe at some point, with the goalies going down with an injury, we already got a look at Joseph Woll. So I'm not sure if anyone thought we were going to see Källgren, because we know that Woll's already capable of winning games at the NHL level, as he's shown. So with him coming up, and obviously had a little bit of extra pressure on him because of Petr Mrazek's poor play lately, and the Leafs being in the thick of a playoff race and needing those 2 points. I thought Källgren was excellent in both those games. He came out and he stood on his head. And I won't even say stood on his head, actually. He stood tall and he made the saves that the Leafs needed him to. And that's all they needed. I mean, his game against Dallas obviously was the best one because he got a shutout. And then that game on Thursday where they let in the goal with like 2 seconds left against Carolina. I mean, not really much you can flame him for there. He still kept him in the game, gave him a great chance to win, and they did. So yeah, I think he did really well in those 2 games. And I think bottom line is the Leafs just needed 2 points, and he did that. He got them the 2 points, which they haven't been able to say with their other goaltenders lately. So I'm happy with him.
First NHL start, really, and he gets a shutout, and then he matched that up with a very solid performance where maybe the Maple Leafs weren't at their best, but they played solid defense. Julian, the defensive game didn't quite match up against the Nashville Predators. They seemed one step behind, chasing the game quite a bit as before, but there were times where they were mounting a comeback. What was the biggest takeaway in that loss?
I think I would say that, like, to start off the game, they were just sluggish. Like, again, I mean, they didn't really show much. They let the Predators establish their forecheck, and they got guys that are fast and that will throw their body around, like Tanner Jeannot, and that Colton Sissons line in itself was really good. I thought they just struggled to get momentum early in the game, and they kind of got that later, but it was a little bit too little too late there. And I think we've seen kind of the reoccurring theme of not being able to tie up some sticks or clear the front of the nets, a couple screenshots. And that one was a nice tip that was basically going way wide of the net, and they ended up getting a stick on it. But it's the positional play in front of the goal that is the reoccurring theme for me. That's been an issue. Källgren was good. He was fine. I mean, what do you expect really from a guy with his third NHL game? I think you can't really blame him for that one either. But at the end of the day, whoever's going to get you 2 points, like Alex said, that's what's important right now. I'm not sure where they go from here with the deadline heating up, but I don't know if Källgren's your answer in the playoffs.
Yeah, no, and he's only there for backup assurance until the Maple Leafs can figure out what they're going to do with Mrazek. And if Kyle Clifford didn't make that jersey pull penalty that led to the goal against, I think it would have been a different outcome because the Maple Leafs were gaining momentum, and that just seemed to have deflated them completely. And even so, this week, I even mentioned that you want to give Källgren the opportunities, and no matter what the result was, you want to see what he can do. If he had a good performance back to back, and it seemed like that, aside from maybe 1 or 2 goals that he possibly could have had against the Nashville Predators, he appears to be your guy. And Mr. Marks has a perfect segue because Petr Mrazek was involved with a potential deal with the Chicago Blackhawks, and Darren Dreger reported that, let me just get the actual trade details. The deal that didn't happen between Toronto and Chicago, it was Hagel and Fleury to the Leafs for Mrazek, Knies, first round picks, didn't quite reach, the stage of what
Tampa Bay level.
Tampa Bay level, exactly. So Dubas has said no to first and prospects for rental players. I mean, granted, you get some stability or term with Hagel. Fleury was a different scenario. The fact that he turned down no to a top prospect and first round picks for rentals, Alex, does this kind of hinder Dubas's plan, or just based on the market, it just seems too risky to make?
I think that trade was just too risky to make, honestly. And I'm personally glad that Dubas didn't pull the trigger on that deal because, as much as I love Brandon Hagel and as much as I think he would have been a great fit on this team, I think a lot of people are forgetting that this guy's only got 50 NHL games or something like that to his name so far. And he's shooting at a 22% clip right now. So I feel like that's something that's going to signal some regression. And, for the Leafs to give up whatever the price was, multiple first round picks and Matthew Knies, I understand that you're getting rid of Petr Mrazek and you're bringing in a guy who's proven in Marc-Andre Fleury. And I know that Brandon Hagel would have been a great addition to the top 6, but at some point you got to realize that, the Chicago Blackhawks, especially in that case, would have been in the driver's seat and they would have had all the leverage and they would have held the Leafs by their fingertips. So it's just one of those things where, yes, the Leafs do need upgrades and they need them between the pipes. They need upgrades on the back end. They can use upgrades anywhere essentially. But, I think that was just one of those trades that it wasn't really worth pulling the trigger on, just because that Chicago was really driving up the price. I don't know if it would hinder his deadline plans because I think there are still other guys available, but I will say that now that Tampa Bay, Boston, and Florida have all made at least one significant upgrade, the clock is ticking for Dubas. He's got to do something, and hopefully it's today or tomorrow.
And especially with the game against the Predators, you saw the defense start to collapse, maybe try and get a piece, maybe upgrade the defense. And we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. But Julian, it seems like in a situation like that, there's only one team that could fork over the assets to make a deal like that. And that is the Tampa Bay Lightning, back-to-back champs. They could afford to give up the assets. The Maple Leafs aren't quite there yet. I just want to get your take on that. And, should Dubas only do this for a player with term? I'm not saying that Jacob Chychrun is going to be available because there were talks that maybe the price is too high, but is that the only scenario where Dubas can't afford to give up players, prospects, picks for a player with good term?
Well, we know the price is going to be high because that's all the market has been now. So everything's kind of driven up, which is why I don't fault Dubas for not making a move yet. I think it's wise to have not gotten ahead of it if this is the price range, because everything is probably going to start coming down from here. Only a certain amount of teams are going to be buying, and with less teams involved in trying to acquire these assets, you should have most of the leverage, which I think is going to be beneficial to him. And I think he's just a little bit weary on giving up that high of a price, especially because of that Foligno deal, because you saw how it fell apart last year and kind of not fell apart, but it didn't work out the way it was expected to. So I think it'll be important. And I wouldn't be upset if Dubas I'd rather not make a deal if that's what he's going to have to give up for a rental, because I think it just mortgages the future too much. And I don't think that the juice is worth the squeeze to add these types of players unless they're actually going to be, because anybody they add now is not going to match the level of an acquisition that, Tampa's pulled off or Florida right now. So how much different are you actually going to get to change your lineup by giving up these high-end prospects? So unless it's something that he can't refuse with a guy with term, I think the Flyers have multiple guys like Martin Jones could kind of come in if you had to, or Justin Braun is there and potentially Konechny. If it's a deal where you're getting a guy with term like Konechny, I can see you guys giving up those top end guys. But for a rental, he's got all the cards himself right now, so he needs to just kind of wait it out and put his poker face on.
I've never heard someone say the juice is not worth the squeeze before. That is a great analogy.
Well, I also like the reference that he made with The Godfather. That's the one thing that I always go for. So props to you on that one. That kind of serves as a perfect segue because you mentioned Julian, he could be in the driver's seat for one potential deal. And there's been quite a bit of talk of Mark Giordano being linked to the Toronto Maple Leafs. And even before at the top of the show, when we were talking about Nashville Predators wanting to get a player that can sort of like clear the garbage out in front of the net and be a little bit of a factor defensively. And Giordano has shown to be that throughout his career. Julian, it appears that Giordano is the top prize for Kyle Dubas. What do you make of this? And what do you think has to be given up for it?
Well, like you said, like he's in the driver's seat right now because Boston made their move for a defenseman. Florida made their move for a defenseman. Not sure what kind of assets Tampa's going to be able to give up if they want one now, because they're a little strapped. But I think, like you said, Giordano wants to be here. Probably he wants to come back. And if that doesn't kind of work out, he has other options to pivot to still. Justin Braun, couple other guys that we had mentioned prior, but the market is not as like volatile right now where he can't, go and look at options and he's not limited. So I think if you're going to get Giordano, you're probably paying somewhere between a third and a fourth and a fifth, or even a second if you're going to have to retain some of that salary. I could see something like that going down. But like you said, I just think that, bringing in a guy like Giordano would definitely help the back end. I think he can clear away the front of the net and, give a legitimate shutdown pair, and maybe slot guys more suitably in the lineup heading into the playoffs without having, some rookies in there or some younger guys that are more inexperienced, right?
And earlier this morning, Pierre LeBrun did tweet out, Seattle's been asking for a first for Mark Giordano, but he also suggests a pair of second round picks or a second and a prospect. Alex, what do you make of that deal? And what do you also make of the fact that, Giordano is a priority for Toronto? And Frank Cervelli did mention out this before that he is the first interest and priority to play in Toronto for the Maple Leafs. I mean, hometown boy, because this serve as sort of like another piece similar to that of Jason Spezza, where maybe I don't know what it's going to be like in the future, but maybe take less of a salary to stay on as a veteran and help this defensive core out and be at its best.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is just one of those things where the positives just outweigh the negatives, and especially seeing what some of these players have gone for at the deadline. If the price for Giordano is a second round pick and a prospect, then you're taking that and running, in my opinion. I mean, the Leafs they don't have their second round pick this year, or do they? I think they do.
They do have their second.
Yeah, my bad. Yes. Yeah, it's everything from third to sixth that they don't have this year. But either way, so they do have a second this year. They got a second, I believe, the year after, and then I think the year after that's the one that they gave up for Lyubushkin. So, yeah, I would say if you've got the assets to make it work, you've got the prospects, you've got the second round picks, I'm taking that deal and running if I'm the Leafs, because you add that to the top four. You reunite Giordano with TJ Brody. That was one of the best defensive pairings in the league a couple of years back. And then we've seen how awesome the pairing of Riley and Lyubushkin is. So I think if you add Giordano to that core, that solidifies that top four about as much as you can. And, obviously that leaves room for Rasmus Sandin to have sort of a revolving door of partners, whether it ends up being Timothy Liljegren, or if they end up keeping Justin Hall, maybe he gets a couple extra reps on the bottom pairing. But then when Muzzin comes back, you've got Muzzin and Sandin as your bottom pairing. And then I at that point, I don't know how you complain about the Leafs defensive core.
Yeah,
I think I
was just going to say that.
Yeah. Adding Giordano to that defensive core, I think just solidifies it as much as you can. And, if there's, this is wishful thinking, obviously, but if the price is a first round pick, but Giordano wants to go to Toronto and that's his preferred destination, maybe the Leafs can be like, hey, remember in the offseason when we essentially gave you Jared McCann? How about it's your turn to do us a solid here? So yeah. I'm not going to put any stock into Seattle doing the Leafs any favors, but at the same time, I think of all the guys that are available, Giordano is by far the best option. If you're looking for a depth option, maybe someone like Jacob Middleton on San Jose, but I think as of right now, Giordano just makes too much sense between the leadership and his experience and what he bring to the room, and also the possibility of him re-signing because he's from Toronto, and you have to bet that at his age he'd be willing to take a cheaper cut.
Yeah, 38 years old, 6.75 UFA at the end of this season. But then again, he is still no stranger to, average production. I mean, he's putting up Jake Muzzin-like numbers where you want at least 20 to 30 points. He had 26 last season with the Flames, 23 this year. So he's still able to produce. And I think that's going to be a very big bonus. And you know what? We've seen how well that TJ Brody, Mark Giordano combination has been for the Calgary Flames. They were absolutely dynamic and one of the best pairings that I absolutely love to see. So to see them reunited on Toronto would be a very, very good, sign and addition. To recap the show, this episode is once again brought to you by the Hockey Writers Sports Betting Guide, a brand new source for daily sports betting odds, lines, props, futures, and daily fantasy strategies and analysis. Be sure to follow THW Bets on Twitter to get the latest everything sports betting related. Now that we have recapped the show, let's dive back into some Maple Leaf talk. And once again, this is very trade deadline heavy. Travis Dermott and Petr Mrazek are starting to float around more in the rumor mill right now. Once again, that deal that was proposed to the Chicago Blackhawks with Petr Mrazek and Travis Dermott possibly playing in his final game as a Toronto Maple Leaf against the Nashville Predators, looking for a change of scenery. Two players that'll definitely free up quite a bit of space for the Maple Leafs to do some work ahead of the deadline. Petr Mrazek is at 3.8, and Travis Dermott 1.5. So you got a little over 4 million. I can't do math at the top of my head, but let's just round up to that. To do some damage and bring in some assets and quality pieces in return. Julian, I'm going to start off with Travis Dermott for you. He's been around for some time, 5 seasons in the NHL for his career, drafted in the second round in 2015. He's had opportunities, but just really hasn't cracked the roster. What do you make of his position, and is he able to turn his career around with another team?
I don't think he's been terrible. I think he's done exactly what you kind of expected or needed him to do. I think he's, done a good job whenever he's been called upon throughout his career. He maybe didn't get up to that top 4 role like we kind of expected him sometime to get there. But I mean, everybody develops at their own stage. So I don't think he's bad. I like that he's still got some value because I think he still has term left and he's still under team control after this year or whenever his contract's up. So I think he's still valuable. I just think he's kind of the odd one out right now just because of the emergence of guys like Sandin and Liljegren. And he'll probably just be pushed into it. He basically got pushed out of the lineup because of players who have been better than him or that the organization is higher on. And I think that, it gives you a little flexibility if you can move them with that cap space. And I mean, these are the tough decisions that you're going to have to make as a GM that's going, looking to add pieces to your lineup for a playoff run. And you got to give something to get something. And like we said, if you bring in a guy like Giordano or a guy who could play in your top 4, then everybody gets pushed further down. And there's literally no use for Dermott because you're already going to have Liljegren or Sandin as your 7th guy. So he's never going to get into lineup. And it's unfortunate, but because he's been so good and long tenured. But if you got to move him, you got to move him. That's just kind of the way the hockey business is.
Alex, Petr Mrazek has an 0.884 save percentage, the lowest of his career. And the next lowest was 0.89 when he was traded from Detroit to the Philadelphia Flyers. obviously the play of Källgren has, been impeccable and a reason for why his name is coming up in the trade rumors. But what do you make of Mrazek in that deal that was leaked with the Chicago Blackhawks? Obviously, the Maple Leafs turned that down because of other reasons that we talked about before. But is this a precursor that, Mrazek is on the way out and they have, faith in Källgren? But if not even that, do they bring in another goaltender in return to replace the play of Petr Mrazek and send Källgren down for possibly fighting for a spot next season?
That is a great question. I honestly have no idea. I don't envy Kyle Dubas in this situation because he has a hell of a decision to make with Petr Mrazek. I don't think that the Leafs are going to trade for a goalie at the deadline as much as we want to see it happen. I think that Fleury probably would have been the best option unless they somehow pull someone like Semyon Varlamov out of New York, out of Long Island for a cheap price or something like that. I'm not sure what he's going for. I just don't see the Leafs being able to make a trade for a goalie. Having said that, in the offseason, I think that this is going to be something that Kyle Dubas is going to look to make work because he does have 2 years left at that contract. And let's face it, if you're an underperforming goalie in Toronto and you're making bad money, you're going to be flamed. And I think at this point, Mrazek needs a fresh start somewhere else. And I guess I could see it if the Leafs wanted to keep him around next year to try and get his game back. And, I guess, prevent that mistake of signing him to the contract, or I can't think of the word right now off the top of my head, but that is something that they could try to do. But I think that Källgren's play has definitely made things a little tougher on Kyle Dubas heading towards the deadline, because all of a sudden you've got a guy who's been winning you some games. He's played better hockey than either of their two starting goalies in the past month. So, it's definitely a tough call to make, and I don't envy Dubas's job here because there's a lot to be done and a lot to be considered when it comes to what to do with Mrazek.
Yeah, and you look at the games and the saves that Källgren has made compared to that. If Mrazek were in that situation, you'd be very skeptical on if that puck was going to be stopped or if it was going to go in the back of the net. And, you want the best for Petr Mrazek because he has shown the play at a top level in the NHL. He's had decent seasons with decent save percentages. It's just, for some reason, it's just not quite working out. And, you want to see the success. It's just not happening. And that's a very big concern for both him and the Maple Leafs at this point, because you don't want to have doubts about an injury to your starter and inconsistency with your backup.
I think going into the season though, too, like this was probably Kyle Dubas's plan from the beginning. Is you have a guy with term now who is on a decent contract at a decent number, who could, he probably wanted him to prove that he could be a number one. And if he did show that this year, then you have your goalie for next season. Just because you don't know what the ask of Campbell is going to be when he hits the open market, right? And who knows who would throw the money at him for needing a goaltender, because everybody in the league usually wants to address that market in the offseason. So I think that was probably the plan going into it, but it kind of looks like it's pivoted now to Campbell. Like Campbell's probably going to require Mrazek's money at this point if they want to keep him around. And that's probably part of the reason they're looking to move him. And then just, sign a UFA goaltender who can be a backup or a two to Campbell if that's the case. And, like you said, it's unfortunate, but that's the way hockey works. And, he's been good in the past, and I could see them kind of trying to keep him along instead of giving up on him as well in the offseason. But I just think that in order to keep Campbell around, that you're going to need that money in other places. And if the right deal comes along to get an upgrade now that you can kind of, get that money off the books so you can use it for next season, then do it, because any goaltender you probably get back to be a backup goaltender is going to be better than Mrazek right now anyway. Right. So at that point, you're already one step ahead when it comes to the offseason.
Because of Campbell's inconsistency during the second half, although that is alluded to a recent rib injury, maybe that asking price does go down and you could try and get him around that Mrazek contract, $3.84 million, as opposed to something higher that would have been absolutely crazy if he was still posting up Vezina-like numbers. So interesting to see how that contract negotiation is going to unfold. But you know what? I think Campbell is probably going to stay. What determined money is, I think it's going to be to determined. jumping into our final segment, we're going to have a little fun right now. This is going to be a rapid fire kind of segment where this is based off of what Elliot Freeman reported in his recent 32 Thoughts. The Toronto Maple Leafs are looking at, some potential changes to their fourth line in regards to the deadline. Maybe they add in a player in return. Tyler Mudd is one name that was rumored to be possibly coming in, but the Maple Leafs could look internally, and they have two prospects, one that maybe actually quite a number of teams are eyeing in terms of wanting to gain as a piece. Nick Abruzzese and Matthew Knies. Both are into NCAA. Both appear to be in line for the NCAA championship as the tournament is going to start soon. But once the season's over, Friedman does mention them as possibilities to take over a fourth line role with the Toronto Maple Leafs. I believe checking Cap Friendly, I believe both players haven't signed their entry level contract, but if everything goes according to plan, and even because of their play at the Olympics, maybe all that can change. My question is, and I'm going to start with Alex first. Who would you rather have as a fourth line player, Nick Abruzzese or Matthew Knies?
I'm going to say Nick Abruzzese just because I think that if you put Matthew Knies on the fourth line, you're going to be wasting him. I think Nick Abruzzese is a little bit older. He's 23 years old, I want to say, or 22. Either way, he's a couple years older than Matthew Knies. And I think that his style of play is a little better suited to where you can get away with putting him on the fourth line. Whereas if you're putting Matthew Knies in the lineup, I think at the very least, you have to give him third line minutes. Like we saw what happened with Nick Robertson when the Leafs called him up initially and they had him playing on the fourth line with Spezza and Simmons. And for a guy like Nick Robertson, if you're going to put him on the fourth line with those guys and only play him 7 minutes a night, what are you getting out of it, right? So I think if we're talking about putting one of these guys on the fourth line, I think Abruzzese is probably a better fit. But at the same time, if the Leafs decide to put Matthew Knies in their lineup, you definitely won't see me complaining. I think I'd be super excited to see either of those players. And one other thing that I will say is that I think the fact that Matthew Knies is even being considered for a fourth line role this year speaks volumes about the potential gold mine that Dubas may have hit in the second round last year. I mean, Knies he's looked electric at every level he's played at this year. He looked good at the Olympics. He's looked good at the World Juniors, even though he only played the one game. He's looked great in the NCAA this year. And I think that the fact that he's even being considered for a fourth line job this year should speak volumes about the type of player they have in him. But I think if it comes down to the two, I'd probably rather see Abruzzese there.
And Tony Ferrari at the Hockey News recently came out with an article stating the fact that, it would, in hindsight, it looks great. But then again, you mentioned and alluded to the ice time. Is it worth having a player of his caliber in a bottom six role? And that's going to be the main question, whether they decide to go with that or not. Before I give my take, Julian, what do you think? Abruzzese or Knies? I
agree with Alex. I'd say just because of the development, where they are at the development, that I would go with Abruzzese because of the role. I think he'd just be a better fit, and you would probably want Knies ideally in your top six, right? To play, give him that opportunity like Robertson got. But in a nutshell, I'd probably say neither. I think they're better off kind of going out and acquiring something. Just because I think that they're going to want to test what they have with these two guys. And I wouldn't be surprised if both of them got to some looks to see what they can do for a limited time before the end of the season, just so Dubas knows what he has moving forward, because that'll change his offseason plan. So I think it's important to see what you have with those two guys so you can make a decision on what you have to do next year. But in terms of going into a playoff series, for me, it's figure out what to do with guys like Simmons, depending on what happens with Kasha here and how healthy he's going to be down the stretch. Maybe you go and get some depth there. But the bottom six is going to be like every year it's going to be just turning over with different kind of guys slotting in and different opportunities. So in terms of that, I would just say kind of roll with what you have. I'd like to see the prospects develop. I like to see them do it at a professional level before jumping into the NHL, getting some looks in the AHL too and other stuff like that. So I just like to take my time with them and let them force your hand where they're going to say, yeah, I'm here and I'm going to stay. You both bring up very good points in terms of ice time, letting them develop, and wanting to see what else is out on the market. But if and only if this is the only option and they do look internally, I'm going to say Matthew Knies, mainly because of the fact that when
I do like Abruzzese's work ethic, and he can get into the gritty areas, but when the playoffs come around or down that stretch, it's going to be a very physical battle. And Matthew Knies already has the size and strength and physicality to match that going into a playoff series. And if you need someone to possibly try and get the physical edge, he brings that. And not only that, we've seen his shot, we see his offensive awareness. He has that capability to be a factor offensively. And even though that the ice time may be around 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 minutes a game, you possibly have a chance to play him a little bit more because he is a little bit younger, and maybe he has the ability to keep up and maybe push someone like Spezza and Simmons and, find that, balance of offense and physicality. And I think he could bring that. And again, it's going to be risky because of the fact that he is going to be playing minimal minutes, but I think he has the strength, the capability, and the potential to be at the moment a fourth line player, but he's possibly someone that can move up into the lineup. And he's shown that he's capable of, being a young player and playing with the best in the league. I mean, we see his point totals as a freshman, see him playing relatively well at the Olympics. So in my opinion, the NHL isn't completely out of the question where he's able to easily adapt. But then again, until it happens, it happens. And until then, it's going to be a really interesting decision to see if they do look internally to bring someone up, or, hey, maybe they sign Curtis Douglas, to an ELC, because he looks like a guy that can drop the gloves and has a little bit of fight in him. And if you saw the recent Marlies game, he dropped the gloves and he showed no mercy. So it's not them. I'm going to go off the board and maybe even say Curtis Douglas again, second time. Jeez. That is it for this episode. Before I make any more mistakes, that is it for this week's episode of the Maple Leafs Lounge. Once again, be sure to follow the THW Sports Betting Guide, brand new source for sports betting odds, lines, props, futures, and fantasy news and strategies. Follow them on Twitter at THW Bets. And once again, that is it for this episode of the Maple Leafs Lounge. For Alex Hobson and Julian Mongillo, I'm Peter Baracchini, and we'll see you next week.